I was quite tired when I made the last recording that I did, so I just want to sort of go back and maybe probably clean it up quite a bit and delineate some things more better, delineate the nice things. Um, so basically, what I'm cautioning is that the kind of the transpersonal capstone that needs to be refined in the development of Keegan stage, or the bridge from Keegan stage 3 to Keegan stage 4. What I'm cautioning is that the transpersonal needs to have a kind of highest common denominator, but a sensitivity to the fact that you're always going to have a kind of mixed secular space, and necessarily so. You need a culture that is capable of withstanding the varieties between Keegan stage 3 and Keegan stage 4. And in some sense, that also means that you do need to be able to censure some types of interpersonal toxicity in some sense, but that you need also to have a wide tolerance of dysfunction to some degree, so that, you know, it is problematic because in some sense you can't expect the transpersonal to fix people and to lift people up. That in some sense you can't expect that, well, there should be an orthodoxy or a dogma that should just automatically get people regimented and on the bridge or something like that. That you can't forego the need to have an embodied interpersonal, that the basic common denominator within a society is the individual, is not the collective. And so if you try to create a kind of transpersonal sort of projection that people will just automatically find, you're destroying the basic unit of society, which is the individual, in order to like be part of the facilitation, of in some sense the transpersonal is like the dream or the atmosphere of the scaled up personal, and the personal itself cannot ever forego its particularly its particular participatory, kind of embeddedness within Keegan stage 3, that we never extricate ourselves from Keegan stage 3 in some sense, that is where our grounding of our principles and our golden circuitry need to develop, even as they might, sometimes the Keegan stage 3 sort of bootstraps us into a kind of de facto humility, but also into, not trying to make every place like every other place. Not in some sense that the personal itself is not the be all end all, that the personal is transcended by the transpersonal, but the transpersonal needs to be have a highest common denominator of refinement in the personal, or the inclination of the personal to kind of have a highest common denominator tendency, so that everything is orientated towards being capable of of synthesis and integration via the medium of the interpersonal embodiment of the particular individual that has that kind of transpersonal thing, so that you're willing, perhaps, where appropriate, or where possible, to model, let's say, the highest common denominator that your transpersonal is capable of exhibiting within a particular context or whatever. But if that isn't really embedded in a kind of bootstrapped Keegan stage 3, in which you are even capable of saying, no, 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 I disagree, I rebuke you, this is the boundary, this is my responsibility, this is your responsibility. If you want to have an argument about it, I'm willing to have an argument about it. But if you don't want to have an argument about it, then it's an impasse, and then I'll just sort of cut you off, or disconnect, because there's no point in continuing relations with someone that. So it's like being able to negotiate boundaries, essentially, and be able to tolerate people that essentially that you don't agree with, and obviously when you need to get along with someone that you don't agree with, then also perhaps that's maybe some kind of legal claim, or some kind of legal, the idea that, well, we don't agree, but you are affecting me and you're affecting my rights. That I do think that somehow the legal system obviously needs to probably be very sophisticated, and because it does need to almost embody Keegan stage 4, but it also needs to kind of be able to communicate itself in sort of Keegan stage 3. And then at least people must know that, when they're dealing with something that they don't fully understand, because, they're not Keegan stage 4 or something like that, then they need to seek legal advice or something like that. But, it would be nice if a society actually did have a proper justice system and a proper legal theory that was civilized enough to actually support the dignity of the individual in a Republican sort of setting, which is, I would say, still it kind of has to make sense with the width and breadth of what goes on in Keegan stage 3, that you don't say, okay, no, you're correct and you should get what you want. You should say, okay, well, in hypothetical you're correct, but you should have realized that somebody else doesn't have the obligation to agree with you, because we have individual autonomy and freedom of thought, and such and such. And it's only when people are trying to do confusing things, where they are trying to combine, some kind of strange logic, where someone is trying to claim something and then they can't prove their claim because they also want to use their right to privacy. It's like that's a bit of a strange sort of thing, that you can't sort of, you know, um, that's almost a technical sort of example that I've got in my head, but that's kind of what some strange things in the transpersonal thing are trying to get away with. The overreach of the transpersonal, the idea that you can just kind of end up with a sociological reduction, or a kind of quite a strange generalization that just bestows and projects onto people uh, an interpersonal problem, which is in some sense not a problem, but just a fact of life, that you're going to have people at different stages, at different levels. And if you don't give people the breathing room to do that, you can never actually have a culture that is modeling enough vitality and health and reasonableness, that you can actually induct them into sort of orientating themselves towards a kind of a better transpersonal resolution that isn't so projective on an out group or something like that. Anyway, and I did properly emphasize, I think, in the last recording, that the interpersonal and the transpersonal do have this kind of inductive, direct relationship or correlation with each other, that essentially the shape of the one is going to often be naturalized with a kind of attenuation of the other, and that is almost an unconscious sort of thing, and the only way to break that unconsciousness is by developing a sort of the third sort of aspect here, which would be the personal, and trying to use that as a kind of fulcrum that uh, and then and then in some sense I also think that you have to try to make that fulcrum as you know to bootstrap as much responsibility as possible on the personal aspect of the unconsciousness, but then have a kind of level reflection between the personal and the transpersonal, that those things are not codependent, but they are sort of they are reflections of each other. And then you can sort of see yourself in the mirror of you can see your personal burden in the mirror of the transpersonal, and make sure that that's square. But then also, you might not have the whole picture. You might have to correspond with other people's transpersonal mirror. If you can at least agree that their personal constitution is robust enough, and maybe you can't see your own personal circuitry that much in conjunction with everything else, and so that squaring off in some sense is a kind of is a contest of transpersonal growth or something like that, by contrast, by comparison, um, attaining towards some kind of highest common denominator, or integration or synthesis, which is in some sense, I think, almost the very nature of what a transpersonal sort of credo needs to uh, envisage. Because in some sense, I think that what the transpersonal is at its best is it's not a broad bridge, it's a long bridge. It's a bridge that has the longest sort of aspect of gradation, the longest, most delineated sort of steps on it. That is almost the high. That's how you set up a highest common denominator sort of bridge from stage 3 to stage 4. And in some sense, when you have the long bridge there, you're able to share that with as many people as possible, but you're able to also clearly see, okay, well, that's where you are in my transpersonal religion, in my transpersonal morality. And I believe that maybe my bridge, my transpersonal bridge, is maybe, it might be wrong, but I don't believe that it is wrong, but I know that it might be wrong. So if you're on the bridge and you think you're seeing a different thing, and I put you on that bridge in my transpersonal projection of it, of where how responsibility works, which is somewhat embodied by my de facto culture, which is somewhat embodied by how I treat people and how I regulate my boundaries and how I navigate between what I consider to be my personal responsibility and what I consider to be an interpersonal sort of layers of boundary and layers of insulation and layers of regulation and how I manage my boundaries and such. Um, and now I have always said these weird things that we need to sort of turn our back on the interpersonal because in some sense it's fundamentally toxic. And so I do think that, so I haven't articulated this perfectly, that you need to detach from the interpersonal but still allow yourself to do the work of managing the interpersonal. And in some sense, sometimes when I say you detach from the interpersonal, that means that like you have to have a personal way of processing the interpersonal that's kind of like automatic, or it's not, it's like it's regular, it's general. I believe that the personal needs to be generalized so that you can develop the proper kind of development of the personal and the transpersonal. That something like Kantian ethics. That you know, I really do think that the whole Kantian ethics sort of thing is a way to navigate yourself out of uh, at least the personal development of Keegan stage 3. But you do need to have a transpersonal thing on top of the categorical imperative or formulations of the categorical imperative. Let me just name two formulations, which I might not get it perfectly. They've been written and rewritten perhaps by other authors, but the two basic formulations of the categorical imperative is something like only permit yourself to do something if you would be able to, the maxim of that action were to be made a natural law of the universe or a natural law of permission for everyone else. So it's like, don't permit yourself to do something if you couldn't frame it as a general permissible, so in some sense that's a way in which you would try to justify your personal stance, that it would be a useful sort of transpersonal installment. Sorry, I've kind of butchered the expression of this slightly, probably. And another formulation of the categorical imperative is like, don't treat any person, any agent, any sentient agent as a means to an end, but as an end in themselves, as if they are capable of being, let's say, a ruler and a legislator. So, in some sense, you see yourself always as a member of the moral legislature of humanity, or something like that, or of universal set. So you have a kind of universality of all sentient life, and you see yourself as kind of equal within this kind of thought experiment. And so when you treat another person, you are in some sense treating a co-ruler and a co-judge in the kingdom of God, or at least a candidate co-ruler and co-judge. So someone who has forgotten that basic nature about themselves. So it's something, in some sense, I see this as a component part of a kind of objective morality, which is, again, I keep on sort of putting that in the, I think that's exactly what the transpersonal needs to sort of contain. But you have to, um, obviously, your personal responsibility, though, as an individual, you can't just say, well, believe that everyone has this status, rather than believe that everyone should have this status. So there's a difference between the hypothetical should and actually dealing with, I almost want to bring up these parallels of how in the Japanese cultural imagination they have the mask of death, and then they have this whole culture around saving face, because you can see the death, because the mask of death, there's a deep religious mythological sort of significance of the death masks in Japanese culture, that they understand something quite deep about psychology. To know that we have a brittle toxicity that is masking our face, and it's always there. It can be examined, it can be found. You can always sort of dig that out and perform character assassination. In this is generally why in British common law, there's a rule against character assassination, because we're all prone to being shown to be deficit and defective on this level, but that doesn't mean that we can't attain towards a transpersonal, so you can always dig out some kind of interpersonal, toxicity. But in some sense, if you are not managing, if you're not mitigating your losses as a responsible individual, then in some sense, you're not bootstrapping responsible. In some sense, you can save people from causing problems. You can teach people lessons quite disgustingly by sort of indulging them, rather than growing your own personal ambit of responsibility and managing yourself, sort of responsibly. Like, other people will induct you in their Don Quixote, kind of fantasy or something like that. And then in some sense, you can't blame Don Quixote that, he was, anyway. Because in some sense, Don Quixote is trying to live out his transpersonal in the interpersonal, because he doesn't have this idea that, identity, uh, is not that identity is fluid, but you have to make, let's say, a personal commitment, and then you have to kind of, live by the sword, die by the sword. But in some sense, the spiritual sword is the discerning, is that you cut the distinctions, and then you live by the commitment embodied by how you have wielded the the knife that can cut itself, even in the interpersonal sphere. And then obviously, you do expect some kind of maybe forgiveness as well. You can't even facilitate harmonious interpersonal relations without some ambit of the idea that, well, mistakes will be made in some sense. And obviously that can also be somewhat more harmoniously facilitated if you're careful with your wording, if you're, if you have a way of being more transparent and more clear about your interpersonal regulation, or whatever. So, this is strange, because it's like, there's always perhaps room for improvement, and sometimes some person's improvement is unwieldy for another person, just because there are also fundamental differences in people's psychologies, that they have a different uh, constitution within their internal psychology, even though that and so that's almost a fundamental hard problem, that I think that you need, if you don't know specifically about personality within the psychology of personality differences, and you haven't worked out how that works into having the same transpersonal connectedness, or the same transpersonal highest common denominator, that is a very hard process, because you can't just use yourself as the model of the everyman. That is one of the biggest sort of looming dark clouds in trying to, develop a proper transpersonal sort of thing. And because you can't bestow undeserved integrity on people that don't deserve to be regarded as Keegan stage 4, in this mad idea that you're going to sort of uplift the whole of society into Keegan stage 4, rather than particular places, particular parts, particular, and in some sense maybe other people won't see that because it's just not their sphere of operation. So you need to have a certain tremendous fluidity, a tremendous kind of tolerance as well, and a tremendous kind of sophistication on the level of the personal, I think, to be able to kind of be sane. Because in some sense you do need to ground society in its practical relations somewhere, like in a transpersonal synthesis that has its feet firmly in Keegan stage 3. Um, that in some sense a republic, you can't expect a republic to operate at Keegan stage 4. The culture of a republic needs to be in Keegan stage 3. And I do think that in some sense the legal tradition and the legal structure and the legal theory needs to basically be Keegan stage 4, because when you're in the realm of adjudication, when there has been a controversy or whatever, you do need to kind of have a highest common denominator, especially when you are arbitrating over somebody else's inability to kind of, anyway. That's a that's maybe a bit of a tangent to this, but in some sense, uh, that's also how you have a high trust society. That's how you have a high functioning society. Is that, let's say, there are enough tokens within the culture to orientate us towards the better angels of our nature, as it can be said. And in some sense, some people do have a kind of toxic interpersonal sort of shadow work that they need to process, but you're not going to fix that with a transpersonal religion of how things should happen. You have to do that in a very that should hopefully be worked out in the interpersonal arena of, like, by its nature it has to. And so in some sense the harmony of the interpersonal has to do with the general health of a society, and in some sense how societies, the I would say the proximate cause of cultural degeneration and moral degeneration is in the transpersonal, because the transpersonal will have a kind of projection built into it on an interpersonal scapegoating, or an interpersonal. um Let me look at my notes. I actually made some interesting notes. Oh, so I finally started mapping this out. That between the personal and the transpersonal, there's this. Anyway, I'm working with this model at the moment. Maybe this is just conjecture, but essentially, I think there is this strange ambiguity between the personal and the transpersonal, where and you have where there's a cognitive function there in the unconscious side of the mind, and it has to kind of function in both directions. It has to look down at the personal, which is sitting on top of the interpersonal, and it has to either kind of, or no, I don't think it's an either, I think it's a both. So it has to sort of both look down and look up. And when it's looking down, it's reading a kind of analytical integration between the interpersonal, that is sort of inculcated within the personal as having an internal locus of control. So there's a kind of this idea in which just above the personal, in between the personal and the transpersonal, there is a perspective that the personal needs to sort of, that some of the buck stops with the personal, And then when you kind of are looking up from this intermediary between the personal and the transpersonal, there's this idea that if the buck continues to be passed into the transpersonal, that that is a reactive projection onto the personal with an interpersonal locus of control. So, and in some sense, you do need to be able to make both of those judgments, because they both might be true. And in some sense, when you make that kind of reactive projection, you would hope that you would only make that kind of reactive projection because, in some sense, you're living under some kind of tyrannical sort of thing. And in some sense, that's that is a fact of existence. That yes, that's part of the nature of living in an unconscious, of having an unconscious part of life itself, in some sense. That yes, you live in a certain time, you live in a certain stage of development, and you have to kind of, you can't just say, well, it's not good enough for me, I want to live in Star Trek. Well, if you want to live in Star Trek, are you going to be prepared to build Star Trek and work out what the next step in that ladder is, and then you're going to, like, let's say, personal responsibility for it, or are you just going to sort of demand it from the ether? And so in some sense, I do think that there is always this, that although you can project onto the personal, and in some sense that projection onto the personal comes with an interpersonal locus of control, you can make that kind of reactive judgment in how, in the intermediary that is kind of looking up and looking down, you can do that. And in some sense you can say, well, that is my part of my understanding that I'm part of history, and I'm part of trying to do something in history. But I mean, I do think you have to kind of be very careful here, that you have to work out how to do that harmoniously. I mean, so this is why I think that, in the West, in the liberal, democratic, capitalistic West, there's almost no excuse, because there's no bar. There's nothing holding you back. If you say that, oh, the rich people are holding you back or something like that, I think that you don't know what the hell that you're doing, or what you're even saying, in some sense, because revolution has never been more easy, because you don't need to have a political revolution. You can just build the revolution by some kind of collective program, by some kind of, you know, build it. I mean, in revolutions in history, you had to go get a whole lot of people and then risk your life and take over the state. In this system, all you need to do is scrounge up enough money to build something that's capable of being independent. And yeah, you can say that that's a bar to entry. Well, I don't think that that's actually such a high bar to. I mean, the bar to entry before would be that you have to risk the life of everyone in your society and do an army or something like that to fight against the power. You don't need to fight against the power. You just need to invest and save, and pool your savings with other people, and buy your freedom from the market. And if you don't know how to build something that can actually exist independently of the market, and that can plug into some substructures, then you probably don't have the confidence to build Star Trek. You probably don't have the confidence to actually be on the ladder towards Star Trek. If you can't sort of progressively make yourself independent. And I mean, I guess the counter argument there is that, well, we just need, it's such a vital, we're in a moral emergency that we have to do this. I must say, I don't believe in the moral panic. I don't believe in the moral emergency. I think that's all false consciousness to some degree. I think that's part of the control system, actually. Um, and in some sense, that means that we, that's the kind of the French Revolution model. Anyway, which I criticize heavily. Which I talk about the Napoleonic corruption. This idea that you can just kind of assimilate everything into a culture, and that the culture is good, and then everything else just kind of exalts the brilliance of the culture, or something like that. My idea of sort of an optimized culture is probably represented by Ian M. Banks's The Culture series. But anyway, and you see the problems that they have with people, with other people that aren't part of them. But yeah, I mean, technically, I think the biggest problem why people have never been able to sort of properly succeed is because of the interpersonal psychological sort of thing um that there's always just been this false credo of a transpersonal kind of anyway, I've made this point multiple times. I'm not going to repeat it. Now, let's say an interesting other sort of facet to this, which maybe I've intimated that I haven't expressed it patently in this recording, is that essentially some people's personal is just not actually capable of being an individual with a complete transpersonal, in some sense, their personal responsibility just does not configure into their transpersonal, the width and breadth of their transpersonal broadness. And in some sense, I think that might be a necessary feature of some people's psychology. And this is why they need community, why they need a communion. That in some sense, they need to be orientated, they need to be sense making as a collective organ in some sense. That the idea of a church, or the idea of that you need to be embedded in some kind of structure that allows you to actually access a robust enough transpersonal perspective, that you actually do need community to exhibit your connection with your transpersonal, because you just don't, like, I mean, I think some people are capable of being individuals underneath their and in some sense I think that it might even be very few people that are capable of truly being individualistic and having a transpersonal sort of correspondence that actually does fit the bill, or something like that. And anyway, I mean, if anyone can make that kind of point, like I've just made it, perhaps I'm one of the few people that deserve to make that point, because I've got a full deep theory a deep theory of consciousness and mind, and models of psychology and comparative psychology. So if, and I mean, this is, I can just put this as plainly as possible, is because in the unconscious side of the mind there are components and circuitry and such that you are always just part of a field circuit, but many psychologies just don't have circuitry that represents all four field circuits, because in my modeling there are four field circuits, and some people's unconscious circuitry just isn't present on all four of the field circuits. In fact, there are very few personality styles that have a presence on all four field circuits. So I would even say that in that understanding, they would have to at least have a friendship with someone, or some kind of connection with someone who has a presence on one of those field circuits that they're missing, because otherwise they literally cannot sense make as an individual, because all individuals are converters from charge from one field circuit to another field circuit. And so the world looks like a bit of magic to them, because the kind of, in some sense, it's not as if you have one interpersonal plate that people are relating to. You have four subplates which make up your interpersonal content that you have to hopefully digest and process by your personal responsibility, and that has to sort of make sense under the rubric, under the cloud of your transpersonal somewhat dream and atmosphere and sort of synthesis of how this works kind of holistically. And hopefully that moral synthesis is a kind of objective morality, and it's not a kind of narrative. But in some sense, maybe to some people, I mean, this is certain. I mean, I haven't languaged all of this out, but I do think about it deeply. I mean, sorry, I'm so bad at pronouncing uh, these foreign names, and I Paggio. Well, it's probably French. Um, the is it John Paggio? I'm so bad with names. He's often does YouTube videos with Paul Van der Clay. Um, the Christian symbolism guy who really likes symbols, and he talks about them, and he talks about narrative and stuff like that. So, in some sense, I mean, I do think that, well, first of all, narrative and mystery are necessary in order to actually develop a robust metaphysics, because you need low, because the topic is so complicated that if you don't have a low resolution map, you just can't learn about it essentially in a compartmentalized form, because you wouldn't have the attention span to sit there for 60 hours and then compute everything by the end of the last lesson and then compile it into systematic understanding. Human beings can't do that. We need subheadings. We need to, anyway. And largely that is because of the complexity in the unconscious side of the mind, that so many things are happening at once. It's all happening at once, and you are kind of reborn into the unconscious side of the mind as an interpersonal sort of entanglement. And then you have to kind of recapitulate your personal responsibility on the other side of almost turning your back on your toxic belief system, because all beliefs in that sense are naively narcissistic, and that will only ever be properly solved when you're sort of in Keegan stage 5. So at some point you need to work out how to stabilize and manage the interpersonal toxicity, hopefully bearing as much as you can in terms of your personal responsibility, and having a transpersonal vision which is not, which sort of is commensurate with at least the amount of personal responsibility that you're taking, and isn't hopefully projecting onto the interpersonal. Anyway, but now I'm just making this claim now, which is quite a complicated claim, which is that some people cannot be, in some sense, individuals about this, or at least they might be in certain states where they can't be individuals. They can't organically develop their individuality without some kind of assistance, without some kind of auditing of their unconscious um, load, because in some sense, how to disassociate and detach from the interpersonal and grow a personal responsibility, as the educational state of your transpersonal sort of, that needs to sort of be a work in progress, and you have to kind of, anyway, that does require sort of detangling the kind of the interpersonal, um, and that does require a kind of blood sacrifice. That there is literally a kind of, he says Jesus Christ himself did not just come by water; he came by water and by blood. And this, the share, and that blood became the wine in the communion, the blood of Christ. That is, anyway. So this idea that we all attain towards the same crucifixion, we all attain towards the same Christ consciousness. That the members in particular are the body of Christ. Anyway, and so without that level of, anyway, so I mean, I'm talking about it as a, I do think that you can kind of inculcate the circuitry of other people, because in some sense you have the circuitry that you have, and then other people can give you circuitry that corresponds to the circuitry that you have. But the weird thing is that some people will have circuitry that just is disconnected from a particular field. I'll have to think about that, or look at particular examples of that and think about, because in some sense that might be that people will always live in that, in a narrative then. But I also need to think about this because it might be possible that people can evolve their metagram, that either their metagram circuitry can be malleable, that they might be able to kind of reconcoct their false ego complex to within the same metatype. It would be interesting to see which metatypes. Anyway, I mean, sorry, now I'm kind of talking about real experimental psychology. That I'd have to look at my models or something like that. I mean, I've been so focused on just understanding what people have, that essentially, but it might also be possible that people could sort of reboot their whole false ego complex and sort of evolve their personality so that their circuitry does have a presence on each field circuit. Anyway, that might not be possible. Um, but anyway, so sorry, let me. But anyway, through the crucifixion, I do think that there's a bit of like almost a reset button that you do gain access to when you're in your super ego. That what you could do is instead of sort of reforming your super ego and fixing that and building the new Jerusalem, you could also sort of, anyway, I don't want to talk about such weirdly experimental things, but I mean, I know that, for example, when I, let's say, even redeveloped the crucifixion within my own mind, probably at a certain young age, it didn't work for me because only half of my metagram circuitry, only half of my unconscious circuitry was active. The other half was pretty much dormant. And that was also, this is somewhat depicted in Full Metal Alchemist, the anime, when they perform a forbidden alchemy and they see the truth behind reality, and then the truth takes something from you. You lose an arm and a leg in some sense, um, because in some sense the circuitry that saw the truth can't live in karma anymore. So you have to forget that you saw the truth, because otherwise you couldn't live in your false ego complex anymore. So sort of that part of your circuitry just kind of gets occluded, it gets repressed, it gets blocked out, because it knows too much and it can't actually integrate itself with the other part of your circuitry or something like that. But so you've got this internal sort of break between, and this only happens in circuits that can sort of develop bipolar type 1, because they literally have two independent circuits. It's as if they have two independent unconscious sides of the mind. Um, that actually fall both inside of the same um, meta-type architecture. So I'm saying words that people might not be able to follow, but essentially the architecture of a personality is all centered around um, the particular development of the superego, which basically is, the superego symbolizes the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and that tree can only be properly healed by, when you're in Keegan stage 4, you reach up from Keegan stage 4 into the Keegan stage 1, which is the superego, and you actually, through the technology of the crucifixion, you're able to take what's good from the ego and to go through the torture of the crucifixion and to take the burden of the sin of the world on your shoulders, and then you resolve the cycle of action, which is the false ego complex. And then because you resolve the cycle of action, you plant a new tree in a way, or you you actually sort of have a golden root underneath that tree, which is basically the New Jerusalem. And then that essentially reinvigorates or reboots the tree as the tree of life, essentially. Um, and then the superego is no longer toxic, and then you actually create a garden partitioning wall in the superego, which actually makes the unconscious side of the mind the ground of the ego, because then the unconscious side of the mind is outside the wall of Eden, and so you've got, instead of the subconscious being connected in its toxic way to the unconscious now becomes the it doesn't have this horrible share. It doesn't have to share itself with the puppet strings of the subconscious. So the naive narcissism of the subconscious no longer infects the unconscious. So the interpersonal unconscious now can kind of represent a kind of a static golden circuitry, which is in accord with the static nature of the ego itself. And this is basically the idea that your beliefs have to be contextualized by a certain metafluidity. It's not the ego, it's not Keegan stage 4, which is fluid. It is Keegan stage 2 that becomes metafluid because of the reformation of Keegan stage 1 of the superego, because of grounding it, because that's where all the toxicity in the false ego complex is sourced. It's in the superego, because the superego was, to use some MBTI language, was a floating parent function that had no structure beneath it, and that is why that floating parent function was effectively a false prophet. It was constantly dispensing fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that it was feeding to the subconscious to create the subconscious, to create beliefs that have this naive narcissism built into them. The weird idea that your beliefs could have, that you could have golden beliefs, that you could have objectively true beliefs instead of an objective true morality, which is what you get sort of in the proper synthesis of the bridge between Keegan stage 3 and Keegan stage 4. So Keegan stage 3 becomes the first side of the mind in the rebirth, in the baptism, that you are by the water, because in some sense the third segment of the divided line is symbolically water. I take the platonic metaphysic to be a model for the four sides of the mind. The first side of the mind ontologically is the superego. The second is the subconscious beliefs. The third is the unconscious emotions. The fourth is the ego actualized role, or in some sense, it's very much sort of to be postulated in present time. The ideal forms within the greater of the greater, but elementally, alchemically, the first side of the mind is earth, the second is fire, the third is water, and the last is air. And the only way to make yourself protected from the principalities of the air is to make it static, is to make that is, you have to be crucifying your ego in order to have a static vision of the one and the good, which the unconscious watery intellect and principles then are doing all the contextual work, and then that context in some sense becomes the when it becomes unburdened by being fixed with the subconscious, because now there's a garden wall between dividing the subconscious and the unconscious, between these beliefs, then essentially rising from the ego that's reaching itself into the superego heals the superego, which was just this floating piece of sort of earth that would just, it kind of structures it in the it structures it in an orderly way in the universe according to the static representation of the one and the good and the intellect in the greater of the greater of the sort of the holy atmosphere or the holy cosmos or whatever. And then the subconscious then gains a kind of freedom and metafluidity that you can contextualize your beliefs. That belief can only be redeemed justifiably by placing the right context. And in some sense, that context has to be grounded, or with the feet of that context. The feet are the principles that essentially have to come out of the shadow work in some sense. And then the problem is that the shadow is so complicated. The realm of the intellect, the third segment of the divided line, the meta rationality, the rationale that is being developed, if you don't have a kind of tripartite system of working out what the between the interpersonal and the personal and the transpersonal, and understanding how, I mean, the problem is that even if you have even if you have the right metaphysics and you have the right transpersonal view of things, your personal and interpersonal might be fundamentally badly encoded, in that you have because the theme in society, the theme in culture, the interpersonal play and drama that you've been a part of, if you can kind of plug the personal into that, in which you're plugged into the matrix. So, detaching from the interpersonal, but still managing the interpersonal as a responsible personal, is a kind of, I do think that the whole resolution between these things, and eventually the very fine-tuned work of balancing between the transpersonal and the personal, which then sometimes when you realize that you're in a kind of confection, that's because you need to heal something between the interpersonal and the personal, because there's an imbalance there, that like maybe you're taking too much personal responsibility because you've normalized something that was an interpersonal transgression, for instance. So there are two separate trade-offs here. There's the trade-off between the interpersonal and the personal, and a trade-off between the personal and the transpersonal, and then there's also this indirect trade-off between the interpersonal and the transpersonal, where you can have sort of a chip on both of your shoulders, and then the personal thinks that everything is fine and dandy, but actually you're stuck between these two parallel mirrors, counting yourself the king of infinite space, but you're bound in a nutshell, because you've just, so testing these sorts of things, like the mysteries, um, and to some degree it's all to do simultaneously with what's going on in Keegan stage 4, because I do believe that what's going on in Keegan stage 3 is a direct representation of what is simultaneously happening in Keegan stage 4, that those things are not sort of independent. You have the health of both concurrently, and in some sense it's all to do with how you are treating the parent function in your ego versus the inferior function of your ego. That the parent function of your ego is like the left hand side of the throne of God and the goats, and the right hand side, the inferior function, is like the right hand of the throne of God. Um, and so if you incline towards saving the fleshly thinking in the parent function rather than leaning into the torture of the inferior function, because it will be a torture to your dominant function in some sense. That some sense you have to your dominant function has to allow itself in the ego to have its synthesis, because in some sense the dominant function is like the aftermath of the proper synthesis of the transpersonal. In some sense, it is the what's that symbol of the Holy Grail? It's the cup that Jesus used to drink from, or something like that. So in some sense, that is the Holy Grail, is the dominant function, and it's a very strange kind of sort of curse sort of thing, because anyway, maybe it's too symbolic for me to even explore it, because I haven't thought about the analogy long enough. But essentially, the dominant function, I would link it probably to the Holy Grail. I think that probably makes a lot of sense. But anyway, that that the wine, which symbolizes the blood that might be in the Holy Grail, needs to, you know, well, anyway, it needs to already have this kind of inbuilt idea that it's capable of sacrificing its own parent function in order to have its inferior function torture the so if you are in communion with the Holy Grail, if you're in communion with that, you have to be willing to sacrifice your fleshly thinking. Um, that's the point. That's if you want to be a disciple of Jesus, pick up your cross and follow me. That's the sort of thing. He shows you the way. So there's no vicarious redemption here. The Holy Grail is not this idea that you have vicarious redemption. It's the idea um, that the crucifixion is in your, that you're committing yourself towards that act, towards that excruciating torture of, you're going to sacrifice your fleshly thinking, you're going to sacrifice your parent function. Man, in one of the recordings that I made recently, I talked through this very nicely, and I think I'm probably going to butcher it now, but it's like, and this only really makes sense, in relation to um, the structure of my typology, or whatever, and being correctly typed, I guess, so that you can see, yeah, this is the cognitive function that corresponds to the parent function in the ego, and this is the cognitive function that corresponds to the inferior function in the ego, and this is the sin of the world. And then with the sin of the world, and it's slightly irresponsible for me to talk like this, because, like, what am I talking about? Am I a wizard talking about all these things that people don't and I don't even have the model there. But in some sense, I do think that this is something that it might be better for also, anyone who is a shepherd of people should perhaps know about this stuff. It should be, hopefully, be a kind of psychological understanding that's disseminated. But, priests, almost by definition of their role, it would be useful for them, I mean, or team, someone within a team of priests or something like that. I mean, it might, well, depending on how well it can be uh, duplicated in people's understanding, because in some sense, at the level at which that I might go through all the details or whatever, it might seem, like, well, this is very highfalutin psychological psychobabble or whatever, sort of. Anyway, but there are sort of bespoke ways that it could be communicated to particular personality styles, essentially. Um, I mean, I've always thought that at some point it would be useful, essentially, to make a book for each personality style, uh, of which, at least in my current model, there are 48 variations. So there are only 48 metagram types, and but then there's more correspondence than that, because people share 17 metatypes. So, and in terms of, although that there might be different unconscious hurdles in the Keegan stage 3, when you're dealing in Keegan stage 4, you're only dealing with 17 cases, essentially. There are only 17 types of cases, but then there are 48 types of complications in those cases, probably. And those complications are also not just in a single variety, that there are subspecies of complication as well, because there'll be sort of general complications because there are three subspecies of metagram type, and then there are also other subspecies, maybe four types of different circuitries, and then you have maybe the other complication that because different circuitries are present in different field circuits, that is also a layer of complication. In terms of not being able to communicate, but also maybe needing to communicate something about the missing field circuit. Or that might be something that is, I think that might also be related to the four corners of the earth or the four winds on the earth that are spoken about in the Dream of Revelations. But I haven't exactly maybe thought about, or also the four, I don't know what they're called, animals or creatures, which are sort of on the throne of God, and I think some of them even have four heads, so they each have like four heads, and they, are around the throne of God, and they say every day, Hallelujah, Hallelujah, Holy, to the most, you know, uh, they kind of sing the praises of He who sits at the throne, which is symbolically Jesus Christ, the Alpha and the Omega, the sword, the one that has for a tongue a flaming sword that's double edged, the symbol of the discerning spirit, the symbol of judgment, the symbol of the Christ consciousness. But so how people can have the Christ consciousness without having reference to all field circuits, I don't know how that's possible, other than through some kind of communion work, other than through the combination of some kind of treatment specialist, some kind of um, auditor that helps sort of yeah, I'm just realizing that this might be kind of very important, because this would also mean that there are some people that are more general than others, and in some sense people that do need to work in a team, that in some sense to make sure that all the insights are present. When I say insights, I mean insights into each of the field circuits, so there's no point in making a team of people where one field circuit is just completely unrepresented, because in some sense that organization, therefore, or that subcomponent of the organization, is capable of being blindsided if it isn't sort of under the direction of someone who has at least some kind. This can also be why some people, they're in an organization that seems to be really good at something, but they seem to be really stupid at something else, and it's like no one in management, because it's like obviously this would be a kind of medium-sized enterprise, and it's like one of the underlings realizes that there's a whole missing component to the business model, that is, that is just flailing in a weird sort of way. I mean, obviously that can also be a projection, because if you're not in on the board meetings, you don't actually understand the vision necessarily, and maybe it is part of a piece of a puzzle that you can't see the whole framing of, or something like that. So you can't just say, oh well, this is a stupid place, because you might not even understand the proper context of the function of it in some kind of holistic vision. But it might also be that if you're in a small enough scale business and there are only two people in charge, that between them they don't have a full marble collection. I can't. They don't have a full set of playing cards. That would be the kind of analogy. And in a lot of ways, this is also how mimetic tribes gain their kind of toxicity, is because they've pasteurized themselves into a kind of half-baked, half-witted sort of transpersonal cultism. Anyway, okay, I think now I have gone through the width and the breadth of these kinds of issues, hopefully enough. Um, I mean, shadow work is the hardest of all things, and in some sense, being growing and doing the shadow work within enough of a context that people have enough, because in some sense I'll admit I have, like I've studied this, and I believe I probably have reinvented or rediscovered some understanding of psychology and spirituality, which maybe hasn't ever existed on this planet, or maybe, was always close to being developed, and there might be aspects of it which I haven't properly grown in my understanding of it yet. But but I do feel like I have the kind of the codex of it within me in some sense. I do feel like I have a kind of sensibility which is broader than other people's, that I know all the pieces of the puzzle that need to fit together, but I don't have practice perhaps expressing it, but I do think I can pretty much feel my way out through it, through that kind of. But anyway, it'll be interesting to see what new discoveries and what new, in terms of how the field sort of comes together. But I mean, this is slightly problematic. I wish I was more active in integrating it. I wish I was more active in. I mean, I am going at an interesting kind of pace, but obviously there are probably more optimal ways of doing this if I was integrating it with bodies of already collected psychological, like something like the Keegan stages and stuff like that, probably have a wealth of. I mean, in some sense, I'm actually more interested in psychopathology. It would be nice to be able to model all psychopathologies. I mean, I think I've pretty much got an answer for bipolar and cluster B personality disorders, and I've probably tentatively got models which should cover a lot of things like ADHD and things like that. I think that is like I've roughly got essentially, well, I've got a very high degree of confidence that the ingredients that I talk about, that it's sort of, I don't exactly know what it is, but I know that it has a lot to do with the subconscious. I know that ADHD has a tremendous amount to do with a kind of subconscious hold, and probably also is connected with some subspecies of unconscious circuitry. That it's probably a manifestation either of tamas. In fact, everyone that I have met that has ADHD seems to me tamasic. But anyway, so like now that these things can be properly understood, it might be also much better at being able to work out treatment for things. But to kind of put it roughly, the Tamasic individuals, Tamasic personalities will naturally have a harder time developing through their interpersonal unconscious sort of. Uh, they'll have a hard time progressing from the interpersonal to the personal, and in some sense, the reason why that is because there's a bit of a kind of a natural. When I say natural, just in the architecture of metagram subtypes that are tamasic, there is this conflation between the interpersonal, which is symbolized by the first two links in the chain of the metagram emotional circuitry, which is conflated with the metatype personal. So they've got personal fundamentally um, embedded in a weird kind of conflated structural way, mixed up into their interpersonal. Um, and so if you live in a culture with a very toxic transpersonal cultism, they are going to be embodying a lot of that in their interpersonal. It's going to show, because transpersonal cultism, as I've tried to explain it, projects onto people's interpersonal stuff, and Tamasic people will just kind of, they'll naturalize it, because essentially they can't tell if it's personal or if it's interpersonal, and so they kind of they convolute, or for them it's a congealed amalgam anyway. So they just end up kind of unconsciously absorbing it. And so, a lot of this kind of ADHD type stuff is because you've got a tamasic subtype of metagram circuits that is literally just kind of being imprinted on by a toxic transpersonal sort of secular religion or something like that. And I don't want, in some sense, I don't want, like all personality subtypes have their own way of doing things in some sense, but like Tomas is not even, I would even say, at a great disadvantage from the other subtypes, because if you give them a movie, if you give them a story in which the story is complicated enough that it explores the themes, obviously the story is not real life, but if you can give a story that is good enough at modeling to the Tomasic individual about, let's say, the cost and consequences of the themes that they have kind of naturally imprinted on, they can, although it can be it can be slightly fractious, because you can say like, oh, can't you see that this movie resolves this theme? Because for them it's not a theme, for them it's personal and it's interpersonal. It's like woven into the actual immediate visceral drama. But in some sense, all metagram circuitry, all unconscious circuitry is only properly cleaned up when you get to the transpersonal section of your metagram circuitry. And when you balance out your metagram circuitry across all of the interpersonal, personal, and transpersonal, then you can fully kind of, let's say, stably do the work of the crucifixion and then get your golden circuitry installed. But in some sense, you have to realize also that your golden circuitry will never be gold in the interpersonal arena, that somehow when you are acting interpersonally, you have to act as a participant. And that's why you have to hope that your transpersonal culture in some sense is good enough that you can actually manage your affairs. This is problematic. I mean, this is the problem of bootstrapping, because in some sense, some parents are horrible parents to their children. And this is a fundamental problem. Like this is how I resolve the problem, that you don't want the slippery slope of the state adopting children. You don't want the state to be, obviously you can perhaps draw the line somewhere that actually it would be better to put children into foster care than to let these parents continue to have their children. You can maybe say, no, this is just this form of abuse, even if it's not physical abuse, even if it's just because it's emotional or psychological abuse, is so egregious that foster care would actually be better than this. But to a large extent, I think that we almost have to say that parents even have the right to, within certain boundaries, within certain bounds, they have the right to, um, let's say, even mess up their children. Because otherwise, without bootstrapping that, you don't even have a culture anymore that isn't controlled by the government, that isn't controlled by a hard power. That if you want to convince people to be better parents, then you should try to educate them. Then you should try to. I don't think activism is really the way to go, really, unless you actually have activism about a particular program that you're trying to promote. That you say, no, 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 we have a training program. We want you to come to the training program. The activism is to get you towards the training program. But even that, I think, is slightly strange, because that's almost like a kind of, like if you really believed in the training program, maybe you would proselytize it as an interpersonal thing, not as a kind of transpersonal secular cult, or something like that. So I do think, I mean, you know, activism around legal structures are interesting, because that's almost in some sense, I think that that needs to be part of a really robust coalition of intellectuals and scholars and things like that. Because in some sense, you're basically saying, no, no, we want a new cultural settlement that is canonized in a kind of in a new constitutional framework. That in some sense, it's a kind of you are demanding a kind of a new epoch. You're demanding a new dispensation of the society itself. So I mean that's the kind of I mean, which in any case I think is only worth doing if you've actually kind of done the legwork and in some sense had debates about it, had open debates. I mean, I would be very loath to try to force a society into some kind of change which is fundamentally controversial when you haven't done the legwork to sort of make it less controversial, to naturalize it or to normalize it through peaceful, let's say non, you know, I mean, this can be hard when you perhaps live in a society in which, I mean, I do, well, for example, in the American arena, I think that I really blame the left. I really blame left journalism. I think the CNN, the MSNBC. This is the source of all the toxicity. Like Fox News is actually the right model. It's a kind of enlightened subjectivity that, in if Tucker has someone on his show who disagrees with him, that person can ask Tucker questions. There can be a back. There's a battle. There's a clash of values. There is no clash of values on CNN because you're not allowed to ask questions of a journalist. You're not allowed to switch the interview around because they're a professional journalist. They're doing objective journalism. I'm being sarcastic. I'm using inverted commas. Um, so they are always decontextualizing and using factoid sort of, their experts are better. They're always just kind of sneering at people and using this disgusting form of sort of satire, that they are satirizing their political opponents, and they're not having an exchange of values. They're not actually debating their values because they can't justify their values because they're so dislocated from reality. They're so sort of utopian in their transpersonal overreach. It's just, it's like a cult. It really is like a cult. And if they actually try to debate values, it would all fall apart like a house of cards because it's built on dogma and orthodoxy, because the narrative is a brittle ideological narrative. And if they did have reasoned debates about it, it would just collapse instantly. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard is probably the only sane person kind of on the left that I can kind of even point to. Well, at least in there must be more, but it's strange how silent they must be. That essentially no one can break rank. That essentially, because the narrative is so brittle that they can't even have a real debate about it. They can only concoct these show trials where they have people on and then they berate them with decontextualization and using sort of this expert false authority, just by narrative sort of propagandistic contextualization. Now, obviously, sometimes Fox News, someone will make an argument that I think is a bad argument, is a very weak argument, and in some sense, I think that the the tendency of Fox News may be to slightly overreach and trying to um, they're trying to match the ire of the left. I think they're trying to, because the left creates this hyperbolic reality tunnel, and so Fox News tries to kind of match the same pitch, of how the values are being so, in some sense, I think to the degree that Fox News does its overreach and makes stupid arguments is because they don't have the values debate, because there isn't, let's say, a Fox News on the left to actually, to have a real back and forth in some sense. Like there's so few people that will go onto Fox News from the left that are kind of actually part of the left establishment, because the left establishment essentially has no coherence in its ideological outlook. It's just a narrative. It's like a slave morality or whatever. But so anyway, the toxicity is really, I think, in the journalism of the left, which, and then the politics of the left and the journalism of the left is sort of this kind of this crystallized sort of ideological corruption. And the reason why I can forgive the overreach on the right is because they're being projected on, and they're, and there are some people that are not on a perfect Keegan stage. They're in Keegan stage 3, and they realize that they're being projected on. And they're kind of taking the bait. They're kind of, and in some sense, I don't blame them, because you could probably have a genuine exchange with those individuals, and if you entered the values kind of debate, then you could even show them something new, and you could show them out. I mean, you could actually defeat them if you actually would just be a participant in that kind of debate. But because no one will debate them, then they have this tendency of wanting to kind of hyperbolically. But I mean, there are many personalities on Fox News that are not hyperbolic, that do not, or that very seldom make, let's say, what I would call a bit of an awkward syllogism or something like that, because it's all based on values, and because the left doesn't touch the values at all, they just concoct these weird kind of narrative claims, these transpersonal sympathy extraction, kind of dislocated, disembodied, sort of groping sorts of ideological projections, sociological reductions, which has quite a lot of bigotry in them. I mean, just on this line, though, I know I'm babbling a bit, is that, the morality of the 90s really had it all right. Non-racialism was properly understood, and that was even, I think, a very good bridge from Keegan Stage 3 to Keegan Stage 4. Um, and now this kind of weird kind of transpersonal racialism, this disgusting proto-fascism, blah, blah, blah. It's so compartmentalized in its amorality, and sort of dishonest about itself, weaving this narrative that is so brittle they have to hold onto it so tightly that they can't even talk about it, because then they won't follow the party line. Very, very dangerous. But anyway, so in that context, I can imagine why it's hard to actually, in some sense, on the right is really the victim of the left. I would really say that historically, in the current history, is roughly accurate. That they are the scapegoats of the left, which is a bit disgusting. So I do, and this is the problem: is that yes, some people on the right do have interpersonal naive narcissism that needs to be dealt with, but how you deal with that is on the personal level, on the interpersonal. You don't deal with that through a transpersonal, cookie cutter, one size fits all solution with this vague utopianism that you can actually have a culture that's in Keegan Stage 4, as if we're not going to ever have people growing up into a culture, as if we're not ever going to have the natural progression of that. Well, people actually need to grow up in their psychology, and some people get left behind even, and we need to be able to progress through that, and we can't just essentially scoff at people. I mean, it's disgusting, and with this fake idea that you can actually have a culture that is statically at Keegan Stage 4. It's to misunderstand the Keegan stages, even, I would argue, as well. But I mean, to some degree, that's a little bit forgivable, because Keegan, I don't think, even fully well, I mean, I haven't read his book, but I would just essentially, because I mean, when he says that 1% of the population, or even 0.1% of the population is Keegan Stage 5, I think it's far lower than that. I think he might just be referring to a high level of sort of Keegan Stage 4-ness or something like that. But anyway, uh, but I know that itself is a touchy subject. But anyway, uh, yeah, so we do need to kind of be living in a fixed system that, people need a point of contact. They need a culture that has values that they can believe in, or whatever. And these people, essentially, they don't care about values anymore, because they're like, no, 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 we're beyond values. We're just like, we just want to follow a program. We just want to follow a plan, as if, like, you can just plug people into. I mean, it's ironic, but I think the Democrats, who keep on wanting to save people from capitalism, in some sense, are themselves the people that are treating people as generic, and also just, as giving them a nominal bestowed high status, which, quite frankly, might be undeserved or might not be undeserved, but then insensitive to that, because, they're just, it is this kind of plutocratic false consciousness where, the elites are too good for their own people, or something like that, and that they bestow entitlements on them, and people that are recipients of entitlements are, in the long run, in some sense, perversely enculturated into a kind of de facto subservience, to, they become beholden to a particular status quo, and you get this inception into a kind of slave morality, which then inculcates more unconsciousness. Anyway, I the general solution to all of these problems is just, don't seek revolution. Try to find a way to model it into reality. Try to find a way to do it on a scale in which you are already free to do it, and it's a peaceful way of doing it, until you can win people onto your side. Like, do it from the grassroots. Build it positively. Don't build it in a demanding way. Do it by consensus. Do it through democracy, if you can, essentially. You know, and then you'll do it the right way. Do it as a movement that is a non-partisan movement, and build consensus. And if people want to have a debate about it, have the debate, so at least it's part of the historical record of the history of the movement. And then you're actually getting your ducks in a row, and then you're actually doing it legitimately. You're doing it responsibly, rather than saying, oh, well, there's a panic, there's an emergency, so we want it now already, or something like that. You have to do it in the right order. You have to do it in the right way. And I do think that, in some sense, the history of South Africa is magical to some degree. I mean, maybe some of the history is a little bit occluded, but even the history as it stands, the history of the movements and such, I mean, you can see the moral degeneration, the cultural degeneration, and which is very, very sad. And in some sense, you can almost link the degeneration of morality to the institutionalized corruption, to how things are falling apart. And to a large extent, it's to do with this false political consciousness and this transpersonal poison, this weird kind of racialism, and that calls itself a neo-morality, which is inculcating this very toxic subculture. But anyway, so I mean, I do think that, again, I don't just blame the journalists, because in some sense they were downstream of the academics, the race and gender studies academics. I do think, in some sense, I mean, we need to have a way in which, see, this is why I think I hate the corruption that's happened in my country, because I do think that the biggest problem in history, from a democratic standpoint, is, when I say history, I mean like moral problem. So like the fundamental problem with why you can't always just have a stable, progressive society. The reason why you can't have a stable, progressive society is basically because when America had the McCarthyist Red Scare, as it's sometimes called in the history books, I actually believe that it was justified. I think you did need to get rid of the communists from academia, because they were essentially plotting a cultural insurrection and a cultural demoralization. I do actually think that was real. But the problem is that how America affected the removal of these double agents, or whatever you want to call it, that were literally trying to undermine the fabric of America, is because the fabric of America, in some sense, also did deserve to be undermined, because the only way that they could protect it was through the process that was the McCarthy Committee on, what is it, the Committee for Un-American Relations or something like that. That they had to use their legislation, that the legislature had to protect the culture. Now, they had to have a political committee to protect the culture, and therefore, in some sense, they already established the precedent that the culture belongs to the democracy, that the culture belongs to the political seat of power. And what about the individual citizen in the republic? This is a bad this is a bad cultural settlement. In some sense, this is fundamentally unstable. This is what I always talk about when I talk about the Napoleonic corruption. You can't have morality owned by the legislative house. Morality has to be part of the republic. It has to be a public thing. And in some sense, this is problematic because there is no rule of law in America. There has never been the rule of law in America, because to have the rule of law in America, you need laws of general application, and you need to have equal protection and equal benefit under the law in some sense. And that doesn't mean equal benefit in the outcome, but equal benefit in principle, that you have the same use of the same legal structure. So you need laws of general application, and you need equal protection under the law. Just to summarize it, to speak through it quickly, America does not have laws of general application because the law in America is not static, it's not stable, it's made by the legislature, and then it's evolved and repromulgated, and new law is made all the time. You don't have a static law of general application. I know you can say, well, what are you even talking about? How is it possible to have a complete law? You can actually. We do have it in my legal tradition. We have the principled Roman law, which is like a philosophical structure. All the law is settled essentially, and that our common law, the substantive core of the common law, is the Roman Dutch law, as we received the Roman law through the Dutch, as the Dutch recovered it from history into, let's say, Christian Europe or whatever, or Christian Holland or whatever, the Netherlands. But that it's a philosophy. So it was already kind of naturalized into, let's say, the natural law in the Christian kind of thing. That was how it was recovered by the Dutch, and then we got it, and then the British took over in this country, and they added the common law. But they left the substantive Roman Dutch law because they knew that it was better than their own legal system. So we have a mixed system of both common law, but the core of the common law in terms of the substantive law is the Roman Dutch. Also, we got the British law of procedure, because the Roman law of procedure is actually quite bad, and the British law of procedure is sort of better. Anyway, so they left what worked and what was good, and they removed what they saw was inferior, and probably they were roughly correct. So we actually have the best of all worlds in my legal tradition, because in principle, all the actions are general actions. It all works like a moral computer. It's like a moral, and it's all completely reasonable, and that's how we can have laws of general application. Legislation can still be created in order to promote the public good, but it has to be received by the substantive law that already exists. It has to accord to the principles and the maxims in the Roman legal foundation, which is somewhat static. And we also have a supreme constitution, which the framework is all very workable, and it's all very above board. It doesn't have any strange. Now, you can create legal tests. You can create modern legal tests, and maybe those legal tests will be updated, and that theory will grow in the precedent. That's what judges are there to do. They're there to kind of philosophize in the jurisprudence, and to develop how to perfect the legal tests. So that is the work of the judge, is to kind of work out legal tests that conform to these kinds of structures. In America, your judges don't even understand that level. I mean, maybe some of the Supreme Court judges do, but in some sense, the judges in America are a completely different kind of animal. They're almost like a secretary. They're just there to be consistent with the grammar of all these sorts of frameworks. And I'm not saying that's also useful to have some of those tools. It's not it's not as if it's a completely bunk aspect to develop intellectually and rationally, but you have to understand that if you have a society that doesn't have the rule of law, you know that's a fundamental deficit. Your society is fundamentally morally impoverished for the lack of the rule of law. Let me just explain why America doesn't have the rule of law. You don't have the rule of law because you don't have laws of general application. You have due process. You give your people due process. But the substantive wing of the law is just trial and error. Because if it's the wrong law, then you'll add more to it, or you'll repromulgate it, or you'll repeal it and you'll make a new one. So the substantive law in America is trial and error. So your justice system is a scientific experiment, groping to, but you can't do law like that. It's like language. Anyway. This is almost like a Noam Chomsky sort of thing. You know, the Romans didn't just come up with their law all at once. They did kind of evolve it, but then Justinian codified it into a giant treatise. And that is really the beginning of the common law. Sorry, that is really the beginning of the Roman law, which was the codification by Justinian. Um, anyway, and then obviously there's a lot of stuff in the Roman law which doesn't apply anymore because the social norms and the social mores, and also in the South African Constitution, would cut things out of the Roman law so that they would become not applicable. So obviously in Roman law you could lose your legal subjectivity. If you became insolvent, you would no longer have an estate. You would no longer be a legal subject under the Roman system of law. You can't lose your legal subjectivity anymore in essentially. So it actually, having a supreme constitution and having the Roman Dutch substantive law has actually now got quite a nice completion. Now, the sad thing is that the American legal system is so corrupt, but it's also so influential that you have these. The reason why I call it corrupt and wicked is because an individual can't stand up to the state. You can't say this legislation is immoral, it's wrong, it's unreasonable, it contravenes the substantive law, because the legislative houses are the voice of they have the sovereign right to promulgate substantive law. And so you can't say that it's inconsistent with the substantive law unless it's inconsistent with the framing of the state constitution or the national constitution. And the national constitution has very weak rights. In some sense, all the rights in the federal constitution are effectively non-justiciable. There's a Roman law maxim that without a remedy, there is no right, and there are no clear remedies for any of the rights in the American Constitution, in the Bill of Rights. And essentially all those rights are very, in some sense, your framers knew that they didn't know what they were doing because they all exist in the amendment section. They don't exist in the body of the text. Because in some sense the American Revolution was premature, and America really had to develop a legal system almost to justify the War of Independence. And in some sense, you have a half-baked legal system because of it. And fundamentally, the problem is that because you have a due process system, people that are richer than other people can essentially just abuse the procedure. They can exhaust the opposing litigant by just running procedural laps around them. But also, if you do want to use a full bench so that you can get like a final adjudication over the matter between, a panel of 3 judges or something like that, the problem is that the substantive law that you have is disgusting because it's invented by legislatures. It doesn't work as a holistic, organic, philosophical, principled system. It's just a mishmash, a hodgepodge of half-witted devices and in some sense, if there's a new legislative device that gets baked up, it's like, and then that tribunal is bound by its precedent in a certain way that it can't properly consider the matter before it. It's not even allowed to properly consider the matter before it. It has to consider the matter before it like an American judge, which is like a creature of statute, which is bound to be the secretary and a rationalizer to rationalize whatever the legislature wishes to do as long as it's a legitimate government purpose and it's rational. Well, I'm sorry, that's not justified. That's because it's not justified because maybe next year the legislative house will issue something more which will change the ruling that would be given right there and then. So the problem is that you will lose in court because the legislative house hasn't updated its morality maybe, or it hasn't solved the problem yet. But then what happens if I lose my case and then the legislative makes a new substantive creature, a new substantive regulatory framework that would have actually allowed me to win my case? But essentially, there's a deficit in the moral republic here that I, as a citizen, if I was an American citizen, would essentially be beholden to the Napoleonic corruption that my morality, my father, is essentially mob rule, is the rule of man, because the substantive law in America is trial and error. It's not complete. It's not a law of general application. And instead you give me due process so that anyone who is slightly more intelligent than me can go find the right kind of precedent to back up whatever half-witted argument that they have that's completely unjustified, but it's consonant with the legal structure because the legal structure is wicked. The legal structure is there to rationalize whatever legitimate government purpose, in inverted commas, which is somewhat framed by either the state constitution and the federal constitution. And basically, my supreme constitutional rights in the American system are non-justiciable. They don't have clear remedies attached to them. You say that I have absolute rights. Absolute rights are terrible. I don't want them because you'll just rationalize that the right hasn't been infringed. And so they're useless rights because they'll just be non-infringed rights because they're so absolute. And the only way to protect your rights de facto in the American system is through the ballot box. You have to fight for your rights through the democracy. That's mob rule. That's not a republic. So America has this fundamental tension built into it. I mean, it's even this weird. I asked an American one time. I don't know if this is the technical correct answer. What is the system of governance in it? What is the system of what is the system in America called? And he said, I think he called it a democratic republic or something like that, or a democratic republic. I mean, what is that? A hyphenated term? Like you live in a republic that has a democracy, but you can't say a democrat. I live in a republic that has a liberal open democracy. So it has a democracy that it also is founded on the values of human dignity, non-racialism, and an open liberal, I guess, the open there is really to do with tolerance and free speech and stuff like that. But there are lines, essentially. I would say there are very clear lines. And I do actually think that in my legal tradition, there are the actual jurisprudence, if it wasn't institutionally corrupted by the political corruption and by this influence from, this idea that the government has a prerogative, there's no mention of the government prerogative, essentially, in the limitations clause of the South African Constitution. That's an American jurisprudential sort of concept, which is very toxic, which is not justifiable, and is also why America essentially. Anyway, that the uh, Anyway, my point is that in my legal tradition, I believe without this kind of political corruption of this identity politics sort of cultism that has allowed government to, or allowed the judges to develop a disgusting institutionalized corruption of the political arena in this kind of proto-fascistic, sort of utopian sort of bullshit or whatever, that you would actually be able, you should have been able to go to the courts and said, these people in the academy that have their race and gender studies, let's look at their syllabus. Let's look at what they're teaching people. This is anti-constitutional propaganda. This is undermining the sacred values that are enshrined in the Constitution. They are subject to criminal liability. That they are literally responsible for constitutional damages. They should at the very least not be funded by public funds, and they should not be given license to teach this filth, essentially. That these people are war criminals in the waiting even, but I mean that might not be part of essentially the kind of censure, but essentially these people should, that is how a republic should have been made itself defendable as the general solution to the McCarthyist Red Scare. It shouldn't have been done through the Congress. It should have been done through the courts. And that is the biggest problem. That's the frozen constitutional crisis, which now is more directly precipitated. Because in some sense, when a social justice warrior goes to court in America, the judge doesn't say, "You're unreasonable, you're immoral, and I will not, and I rule against you." That's not what they hear the judge saying. The judge says, and I'm making this is a metaphor and generalization. The judge says to the social justice warrior that goes to court, "You don't have enough political power to make me rule in your favor yet. Come back when you own the legislative house." And then if people want to protect their constitutional rights, which are vague and nebulous and embarrassingly constructed in the first place, people have to use the ballot box. And so it is an information war in America. There is a war of narrative. And the Democrats are so toxic in this war that they can't see the wood for the trees, essentially. The cultural degeneration, they're so unreasonable, essentially. I mean, they can't even contact themselves in a common sense sort of thing, because they're, the moral emergency, the moral panic is so high, or whatever, of the immorality that they project onto other people as they essentially, anyway. So it's an abuse of a moral narrative. It's probably what Nietzsche was referring to exactly when he talked about slave morality. Um, anyway, what's my point? Is that in the South African legal tradition, all of this government overreach, all of the unconstitutional legislation, the promotion of Equality Act, which essentially has this very disgusting form of racialist affirmative action, which disempowers people and perversely incentivizes people to develop a racial consciousness, as the act itself promulgates a form of cultural degeneration and corruption, but also in a way in which you can't actually target disadvantage. You have to give benefits to tokens. People are given this symbolic token racialist pride as a way to heal the wounds of the past. It's so disgusting and despicable, because it has nothing to do with uplifting people. It has to do with uplifting their identity. And so the only gain we've had in this country is essentially the rise in cultural racialism, and the rise in racial consciousness, a very toxic form of anti undevelopment in some sense, the undermining of non racialism wholesale, and there is no solution essentially to this, except to empower the government to be more unaccountable and to scapegoat more of their failings onto minorities or onto sectors of society that are part of the social justice narrative. Oh, it's capitalism. It's not that the fact that we have corrupt politicians that don't know what they're doing and that they aren't even responsible for their own failed policy. It's always just, oh, the problem is capitalism itself. It all just gets conflated into, oh, well, we have an environmental crisis anyway, so capitalism needs to end anyway. So obviously, government should just have more concentration of power over everything, and the individual should all just be seen as the child of the state and the moral child of the state, and it needs to just do what's good, do what you're told. Never mind civil liberty, never mind freedoms, never mind your rights, your constitutional rights. Just do what's good for you. You know, all the overreach, the government overreach in terms of COVID, all of these unconstitutional provisions, as if you can make rules and restrictions that are based on some people in society. You know, why should everyone have to be burdened by a stricture, by a regulatory framework, just because of the imagination that some people would not be able to follow the rules? So you're going to create blanket rules because you can't be specific about what is actually problematic. So because you're too lazy to actually say, don't have gatherings. Don't have gatherings on a beach. You're going to say you can't use the beaches. I mean, that's one blanket example. They say you are banned. You're not allowed to. No one is allowed to go to the beach and to make use of a public beach. You can't do that. Never mind if you're 3 meters away from somebody else. No. Instead of saying no gatherings on the beach and you must always be 3 meters away from somebody else on the beach or something like that, instead of having regulations saying, well, if you want to be around someone, you have to wear a mask. But if you're 4 meters away from someone, you can't. Instead of actually working out all of those sorts of things, so that you could perhaps not have a mask and be in a public beach, instead of making less restrictive regulation, which in the limitations clause, there is an onus to justify your measure that you have not taken an over restrictive measure when you could have taken a less restrictive measure and not infringe the right as much, essentially, at the very least. That's the only way to justify your policy. Government is not interested in justifying its policy in relations to the limitations clause. It doesn't care anymore because it's been empowered by this toxic proto-fascist transpersonal cult of identity politics and social reductionism and just generalizing at people and projecting onto people's identities. It's so disgusting. And their whole excuse is that, well, we need to protect some people that otherwise wouldn't be able to follow the more sophisticated regulation. So instead of actually doing the work of education, we're actually treating our people more like invalidated simpletons. In some sense, apartheid had more respect for its citizens than this government does. Disgustingly, ironically so. The kind of disrespect, the kind of basic denigration that this bakes into the cultural political landscape is not justified in an open and democratic society. And the kind of dramatization, the kind of leadership that this government gives is so disgusting, is so proto-fascist. It's embarrassing. It literally is embarrassing. These people are the people at the top that should be in jail for the constitutional damages that they have perpetrated on their citizens, treating their citizens like they are children. Government should be requesting our compliance with its requests about how we should manage COVID-19. It should not be dictating to us about public health. Public health belongs to the public as well, not just to the government. The government is not the voice of the people, not in the South African context, not in the South African legal tradition and South African framework. There is no governmental prerogative for moralizing for the population at large. We are an open, liberal, democratic society. This kind of public health hazard does not warrant this kind of governmental overreach. This is completely unjustifiable. It's also a form of human experimentation because we have never had a COVID vaccine before. We are messing with epigenetics here. We're messing with a lot of things. This is quite arguably incredibly unsustainable and counterproductive to public health. So what? Old people that have weakened immune systems must never die? Is that the rule? That we must never allow COVID viruses to kill old people so that they can instead be infected by other forms of bacteria and other forms of virus that might be much more deadly, incubating in the opportunity of a weakened human immune system, so that we can instead teach other viruses to kill our old people instead of them being killed by the COVID viruses and the other forms of influenza. We have coexisted with flu for a long time, and in some sense, flu has become less deadly. We used to have real deadly flus that would kill children. This virus does not kill children like the deadly flus of yesteryear, and that is because we mix with each other on a level that didn't exist before. We used to have every 20 to 30 years, we would have flus that would kill the young children at the same rate that it would kill old people. This flu essentially is not, yes, it kills some people that also have pre-existing health conditions. I mean, you know, this would be part of life. You would hear, oh, there was a 40-year-old who died of pneumonia. Pneumonia would always sometimes kill people young. It's just like, it's a fact of life. Now there's this sort of, it's also somewhat exacerbated because we had a very weak flu this season. That the influenza killed much fewer people than in the normal year. So more people were available to be overcome by the COVID, by this novel COVID, and then in some sense we think that this virus is somehow even much more deadly than swine flu. No, swine flu, I think, was very much commensurate with this COVID-19, and that might have even happened if we had had the same response to swine flu. We didn't have a lockdown during swine flu. We have had a lockdown during COVID-19, so what we've actually done is we've maximized the incubation period for this virus, because we've consistently slowed the spread, even when we shouldn't have been slowing the spread. Because if we didn't slow the spread when we had hospital capacity, we would have been much closer to herd immunity, and we would have had much more of an insulating factor, and maybe we would have also avoided the mutation of the virus. More people would have already been exposed to the virus before the mutation, and then, this idea that, oh, well, people will all across the board only be immune for 3 months when they get it. That's a complete invention. Some people, when they get it, maybe they'll only be good for 3 months. Other people, when they get any COVID virus, they're immune for the next 5 years. Because everyone has different immunological responses and mechanisms. We're not all the same. The model of generalized medicine, so there are other forms of immunity, there are other forms of protection, and maybe this virus has actually gone through some of those forms of protection now that it's mutated around that. But many people have already had the virus, they were completely asymptomatic, and they are also have gained an immunity because of that asymptomatic. So, I mean, this is also why it's somewhat vain to try to think that you can track and trace it when so many people are asymptomatic. But anyway, I mean, there are all these aspects to it that the experts, I mean, in some sense, this is a failure of journalism. Journalism has really destroyed democracy to this extent because they've been radicalized by identity politics. They've been radicalized by creating this transpersonal narrative of, well, we just need to get with the program, that we don't believe in a republic anymore. It's disgusting. In some sense, I blame the journalists, but I also blame people. Well, I mean, in some sense, I particularly blame the academics. I do blame the academics and their false authority of their expertise when they're not honest about the limits of their own field and the knowledge of and their particular controversy within their own field. They always pander and hypothetically make these projections according to, and the people who are honest will be tentative about what they say, and they will say, well, this is my opinion, and and then they give you a bit of a 5-minute debate, but then they let the people who are fearmongers kind of concoct this whole kind of worst case scenario hypothetical narrative in which it's responsible to do as much as you can, and they overlook the fact that they are also then engaging in a kind of unsustainable human experimentation over the long term. Public health is a very complicated subject matter. The idea that you're just kind of going to pass it out, PARSED, to have it passed in a kind of lowest common denominator political fashion, is essentially the end of a republic. And it's the beginning of a kind of big brother authoritarian tyranny. And this is the kind of unaccountability for the lack of sophistication in government policy, which is what has allowed for the kind of institutionalized corruption in the state and in the government. Because, as long as government can be saying that they're doing something to help someone, to sympathize with some group of people, then they're allowed to infringe anybody else's rights. They're allowed to do whatever they want. In some sense, it's a disgusting test case, ironically, for this expropriation without compensation, where we will be completely the chattel of our governmental overlords and completely prone to their never-ending corruption and unintelligent form of un, you know the courts should really have done more. The court, I mean, the reason why they haven't done more is because the courts themselves have corrupted themselves to confirm and validate this disgusting political corruption, but also the institutionalized corruption within the ANC. So it's a very sad. Anyway, my other recordings go into this particularly. I'm kind of ranting now, but this is where that kind of transpersonal cultism leads you to. Um, for me, it's sad because it should have never happened in South Africa, because our legal tradition is stronger than any other legal tradition. We have the best legal system in the world. We have the best constitution in the world, and it's been betrayed by people based on expert testimony and not contextualizing that testimony in any kind of proper context. I mean, the disproportionality of all of this. I mean, the kind of human carnage and the human suffering caused by the governmental overreach itself is unjustifiable. The idea that you can make blanket rules for an entire group of people just because some people can't be expected or something like that to perfectly follow, as if because some people might have a tendency that they would have trouble following the more sophisticated regulation or the more measured regulation, that somehow we should all put up with the lowest common denominator. I mean, it's absolutely insane, not to mention irresponsible in terms of the knock-on effect and the knock-on damage. It's as if, I mean, this is scary because, if you continue down this road, you're essentially creating a self-fueling, self-undermining excuse to have a fascist revolution or something like that. In some sense, this is almost designed to increase the temperature and the blame on essentially the white monopoly, capital slander, and stuff like that. The racial identity consciousness propaganda and ideological narrative, when it really is an unintelligent government with an unconstitutional policy. But because everything has been the legal positivism, the development of the legal theory to incline itself towards just accepting a governmental prerogative and not constitutionally throwing out this disgusting kind of, I mean, just because it conforms with the ideological narrative that is in the rubric, which is in the formula of identity politics. So I do think that is the great evil of our day, is this transpersonal cultism that projects interpersonal toxicity onto people, that maybe they do have some toxicity, but that needs to be worked out interpersonally, not on a transpersonal group moral level, as if we all belong to the same cult, as if we all must believe the same narrative. No, we mustn't all believe the same narrative. Thank you very much. I'll have my freedom of conscience, I'll have my freedom of speech, and I'll have my freedom of association. Thank you very much. And yes, if you're going to set upon people and say, no, you can't have these things, then you're going to make any kind of situation worse. And you're not going to even be persuasive or convincing because you're that's not your route. You haven't chosen to be persuasive and reasonable. You've chosen to be a false authority, and you should constitutionally be taken down a peg. Through the power of the Constitution, through the judiciary, you should be probably, if you're a government official, peddling this kind of unconstitutional infringement. I mean, I really think that these people almost deserve to be locked up. I mean, it's actually it's unconscionable the level to which that these people have entitled themselves to be this infantilizing force over other people's constitutional rights. And in some sense, that's the fault of the judges themselves who bought into this prerogative bullshit. There's no mention of a governmental prerogative in the limitations clause. And there are certainly less restrictive measures that could achieve the same governmental purpose. So there is no excuse for this lowest common denominator form of regulation. Anyway, I'm just repeating myself now. This is going to be an addendum that I'm going to append to what is obviously a very long recording, so that's a bit sad. But anyway, I've come up with a good synthesis of some other ancillary issues. So I think that we come across when we're dealing with people that are in the midst of shadow work and they don't have the tripartite sort of model of interpersonal, personal, and transpersonal, people that are atheistic perhaps are not really capable, I think, of doing proper shadow work. Well, when I say atheistic, I mean that broader, in that I think the transpersonal needs to be understood as a kind of, as a faith position, as a faith-based position. And I can describe it in functional terms because it is the ability of your transpersonal faith that has the ability to resequence your own other circuitry. Because the last two components in the six chain, the six components can create a circle, can create a loop, a recurring loop of being trapped within it. But essentially, the last two links in the chain, if they are understood properly, they are understood to kind of be taking components of the other. They are replications of other components in that chain. So, in the first four, two of those are replicated as the last two, and those last two together are like the transpersonal faith, because it, in some sense, it has the ability to resequence or to replug itself back into the first four. And so through the process of cycling, that first two is like a retake. Sorry, those last two are the transpersonal can allow you to reprocess your own circuitry. Obviously, you don't get to pick and choose which. That depends on the subtype. So the subtype, the three different subtypes, the last two resequences will be correlated with different. Anyway, and also in the specifics of the actual metatype cross wiring as well, there'll also be more unique features that go beyond the three subtypes. But anyway, there are three major patterns of sequences. So there are, in that sense, there are three subtypes of unconscious. But anyway, so people who are generally sort of that kind of atheism that I'm trying to describe are usually tamasic, because they are very embodied in some sense, and they don't like the idea of resequencing themselves, because if they can resequence themselves, so this is why tamasic people generally have a reticence towards staying in the interpersonal, and then they end up not, since they end up negating that the transpersonal is a faith-based position. And because they negate that, or because they relate to it in such a personal sense, they can't share that except in very mechanical terms with other people. And so it becomes a kind of it becomes fundamentally almost like a cult. It becomes like a transpersonal projection of something that they already personally embody and personally believe subjectively. So in some sense, their view of the transpersonal is a very intrasubjective kind of thing, which is, I mean, I guess but that's dangerous because in some sense, in that formulation, it in practice, it's vaguely good enough, but it's not, I would say, good enough to be a proper transpersonal kind of structure, because in some sense you're going to end up projecting your transpersonal de facto faith, which you don't believe is a faith, and that you're just kind of, you're not going to do the work of working out how to communicate it to other people. You're not going to do so your transpersonal unconsciousness in some sense is more to do with your interpersonal grounding, which I mean, obviously all types are potentially capable of having this kind of problem, but tamasic perhaps slightly more so, although there might also be unique exceptions because certain circuitry as well, just because of the particular cross wiring, will have a particular oversight over some of the complications. So there will be tamasic individuals that will themselves be perhaps very capable of seeing their own shortfall in this and almost transcending it as well, and others that are perhaps embody it in more of an unconscious projection onto the transpersonal. But anyway, so what I'm saying is that there is a plethora of variety within typology and things like that I'm just kind of vaguely pointing at. So there's going to be a huge smattering of different permutations of these sorts of themes that won't even in a strict sense always manifest. But anyway, so I'm just trying to say that it's more complicated and that these generalizations don't even hold. But vaguely speaking, um, that and this is what I would generally call solipsism. So this generalization of tamasic subtypes, I think, are prone to this kind of solipsism, in which, in some sense, there is no transpersonal dimension. It's just an intrasubjective transpersonal confabulation, and then that also allows them essentially to not have a high integrity, because they can diplomatically and politically do intra-subjective sort of the means justify the ends, because in some sense there is no shared transpersonal. It's an intrasubjective view of the transpersonal, so they don't actually believe in the transpersonal as something that can be objectively commensurated and shared with other people, that it's so embedded within the individual psyche, and they have so much atomism, so much materialism, so much fundamental inculcation into this idea that there's a physical substrate, and that there is no idea of a kind of a transcendence in some sense. So there is a kind of dualism, there is a kind of thing which you I do think you get from understanding that you have to really juxtapose the personal against the transpersonal, and you have to realize that essentially the toxic influence of the interpersonal in making it hard to actually get to grips with this simultaneous mystery of life in some sense, because it does parallel and it does resolve also in principle, but it doesn't resolve in practice the eternal toxicity of the subconscious in how your beliefs are puppeting your interpersonal unconscious. That you need to find a way to, in a tentative way, turn away from the interpersonal, detach from the interpersonal, so that you can detach from the toxicity which is coming from your naive narcissism, which is an intrinsic property of the subconscious, which will only be resolved once the ego is crucifying itself and healing and grounding the superego, because in some sense the subconscious can't help that it's toxic, because it's been misled by the false prophet. And the only way, so there's a metaphysical process here, and in some sense the whole metaphysical process is in its in the seed form, in its infancy, is all within the tension of the unconscious. This is the problem of the unconsciousness, is that, or Keegan stage 3, is that it is a microcosm of the whole false ego complex. It's like the whole problem is condensed all into a single sort of thing, where it's like, is it you, is it me, is it the culture, is it you, is it me, is it morality, is it you, is it me, is it God himself, is it real, is it religion, is it you, is it me, is it the narrative, is the narrative a transpersonal narrative that deserves some kind of attention, or is it just a myth, is it all just a constructive hollow, how does it matter? And in some sense you have to realize that between the personal and the transpersonal, that the transpersonal needs to be an honest and honorable reflection of the personal, but it also does need to kind of affirm the ability in the present. The metaphor that I always use is, imagine that you just woke up with no memory. Imagine you had to restart your life with no memory. How would you... It's a good way of grounding yourself in a kind of transpersonal recapitulation of being able to have the conceptual power and majesty to have the intellectual sort of static state. Now, that is how I conceive of it. That might not be actually therapeutically how everyone should go through it in some sense. But in some sense, that actually maybe to some degree you do need to know, because that will tell you about your personal unconscious boundary. That will tell you what you know that you need about your personal unconscious boundary, and working out how to bootstrap and working out how to kind of outline where the interpersonal begins and where the personal starts, or where the personal ends and the interpersonal begins. You need to be able to make these distinctions, these boundaries between these three distinctive parts of the shadow work. That there's interpersonal shadow work, personal shadow work, and transpersonal shadow work. And you have to understand that the toxic relationship between the interpersonal and transpersonal, and that the fulcrum between these two is the personal, and that needs to be the strongest in some sense. But also it needs to be reflected, I would say, with slightly more emphasis. It needs to, it's weird that the transpersonal and the personal, somehow the transpersonal needs to be broader. It needs to cover more ground than the personal in an aspirational way. That the transpersonal needs to be aspirational but realistic as well. It needs to be visionary and realistic. It needs to be realistic about the interpersonal as well, in the width and breadth of the possible experience of the whole unconsciousness. The transpersonal needs to cover the whole organic flow of life and the circle of life, starting from the interpersonal, but also being able to draw lines, because you can't just tolerate everything. You can't tolerate things with no end. There has to be some structure as well, so it has to be soft and hard. And that is a very hard thing to sort of fathom, where the boundary should sort of be and what the dream should be, because in some sense, maybe we do live in a fallen culture, or there are many parts of culture that are fallen, and we do need to say, no, well, there's actually too much weather, there's too much chaos. We shouldn't live in this dry land, because this dry land has tornadoes going through it, or it has this going through it, or it has that going through it. Or if we want to live in this dry land, then we have to build stone houses, or we have to build on supporting structures, or we have to build dams. We have to, if we want to live here, we have to do it in a way in which we have, so in some sense the severity of the condition will need a certain kind of so there is a anyway so sometimes you do need to project things onto the interpersonal from the transpersonal to meet the needs of the new environment or something like that. But without the fulcrum of the personal in between mediating these sorts of things, and checking at itself and looking at itself and allowing the interpersonal sometimes to pierce the veil and allowing the transpersonal to be pierced in order to be updated, is a dynamic kind of balancing act that the personal has to take responsibility for itself. And without, and if you just want to always just say no, 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 I'm shielded by my transpersonal dream, I'm shielded by my utopian vision or something like that, then you're too visionary and not enough realistic, and not enough of a realist. So there's this tension on either side of the personal. Between the interpersonal and the personal, you have to be realistic, and between sort of the personal and the transpersonal, you have to be visionary. And that quality of vision needs to also be commensurate with realism. So it's this, and that is a fine, and knowing that discernment of the personal is a knife that can cut itself. And so you should be very careful, in terms of what you're transposing around these sorts of things, because you end up with a personal responsibility that has two chips on its shoulder, would probably be the most undetectable sort of thing. Now, I don't want to complain too much about the two chips on the shoulder, because sometimes we'd say, well, no, actually, that's something that I want. I want two chips on my shoulder, and I do it consciously, and then it's actually okay as well. Because can you find other people that are willing to agree with you? Can you find, but then, you have to be careful, because maybe you're breaking the circuitry itself. So you need a kind of psychological knowledge to ground you there, because otherwise you don't know just how irresponsible you're being, just how unsustainable you're being in the long term, if you're kind of breaking some kind of basic natural internal thing. Because you can't just, I mean, in some sense, we could have always had peace on earth in any age if just one religion had completely taken over, or just one cult had completely taken over, or one political system had completely taken over. If everyone actually all conformed to the same belief, then there could have been peace on earth in any age. If everyone just believed in the same dogma, if everyone just believed in the same orthodoxy, if they just believed in the same rule code, and then you would have had a different kind of corruption. And in some sense, to a large extent, that always happened in different pockets in different ways in every epoch as well, because the spirit of man doesn't care to know thyself, so that it can conform itself to. And I was thinking as well as maybe that is the solution to the problem with people that don't have access to every field circuit. How they gain access to every field circuit is through something like a narrative, but I still don't like that word narrative. I would say that a better way of talking about it would be the law. That there's the law that governs the personal, which is something like, even which you should hope that the law in your culture is compatible with your personal values and your personal morality, and if otherwise, then you should seek to peacefully fix the law, perhaps, or develop the law. Hopefully you live in such a culture where that is a respectable measure to do, and then you should then understand that there's a higher law, even higher than that, which is like the spiritual law, which is your personal transpersonal dream, your personal transpersonal vision. And you can share that vision, but you don't just share that vision by projecting it onto people. You can project it onto people, but you should maybe keep that private until until you're invited to share, or until you ask if you can share, or until there's some kind of tacit agreement or tacit contract. I mean, well, this is a bit, like, I mean, greetings are themselves always this is the problem when people try to create a utopian ideology around, oh well, you are so interpersonally dirty, you don't even know how to greet people according to my convention. So there's a kind of intrinsic tolerance that should hopefully be baked into the law of a society itself, that they have this kind of basic idea of tolerance or things like that. Oh, you used the wrong greeting, off with your head. That's kind of, it's a bit unjustifiable, I would argue, but in some sense a lot of this kind of reasonableness has already been baked into the narrative, been baked into the culture, but we do need to recapitulate it in a principled form, because otherwise, when we are experimenting, we don't know what we're doing. So there is this idea that because we stand on the shoulders of a lot of people in history, we don't even understand the substrate, because it has so much functionality baked into it that we've never had. This is why it's unconscious. And it's only the transpersonal that allows us to actually transcend the unconsciousness, essentially. Um, and it is the atmosphere that allows the breath of life, in some sense, to persist around your personal sphere of action. Just because your personal sphere of action has the real air of life, because you think your transpersonal faith is the hot thing, is the good thing, is the functional thing, doesn't mean that the world suddenly is on your side. It just means that you have a style of interaction, and hopefully that'll be enough to kind of make you through. But I mean, not necessarily. I mean, you could still be marauded if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. You could still be martyred. You could still be pogromed. You could still be persecuted and destroyed. And you would hope that also you have enough, let's say, interpersonal know-how, that you have some diplomatic tact, perhaps, and obviously this is some that's can sometimes be, sometimes there's no good way of, I mean, would be like in Star Trek. You don't make contact with a pre-warp society. You leave them alone to develop, because they are in, you know some people are just not ripe to be interacted with, in some sense. And this is, and you would hope that we would live in such a culture in which there are enough signposts, there are enough general orientating structures. I mean, this is the problem in America, is that because of your wicked legal system and compartmentalized amoralism, that there's very little substance there to even ground Keegan Stage 3. And so the people that supposedly make it to Keegan Stage 4 are still actually under the sea. They're under the maritime law. I mean, the legal system does actually kind of reflect this to some degree. There's a parallel there. But, and in some sense, it's necessary that the culture is under Keegan Stage 3, because I don't think the culture can rise above Keegan Stage 3. But we can hope that it has enough dynamism within it, and enough, let's say, wholesomeness, and enough models, and enough, let's say, celebrity of the right quality, and thought leaders of the right quality, opinion leaders rather, called, that there are enough intellectual elites that have a platform that people can hearken to, and that there aren't these siren calls for toxic that essentially, that when there are toxic transpersonal cult leaders like CNN and MSNBC, that there will be intellectuals that will stand up and say, no, 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 this whole scapegoating of the right is pathetic and it's disgusting, and you are the cause of all the problem. The problem is not Fox News. The problem is CNN and MSNBC. It's the left journalism is toxic as hell, and it's projecting onto the right, and there's no dialogue partner for the right. And the left is so insane and so transpersonally overreaching and projecting onto people an interpersonal toxicity, which is just because it's doubling down on this idea that we can somehow collectively transcend into Keegan Stage 5, or even collectively transcend into Keegan Stage 4 as a culture, which I think is an impossibility in some sense. That the secular will always kind of be in Keegan Stage 3, but we have to have a kind of secular tolerance of faith, and in some sense, the category of the transpersonal need. And so some people do fall underneath that, because they have gotten into a toxic subculture, a toxic intellectual, they've perhaps been misled by someone who had a very highfalutin sounding theory, a very some false expert, some false authority, and in some sense they'll always, you can't outlaw false authority. you can perhaps have a legal process in which, you can kind of prosecute a false authority for a kind of, in some sense, I don't think you can argue about cultural damage. People should, in some sense, be allowed to mislead each other culturally. You can't outlaw certain kinds of opinion, essentially. But uh, but there are certain lines that shouldn't be crossed. That essentially state resources well, you should have at least a legal system that has the confidence to protect its own structure, its own integrity. If you Otherwise, you live in a value that devalues itself. You can say, well, no, 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 you can say, you can have an argument that the law itself is wrong, but you kind of have to make that particular argument, and in some sense the real forum to do that in is even a court itself, unless you live in a system of justice, which shouldn't be called a system of justice, because law cannot be refined in the court itself. It can only be slightly modulated, and it's all actually created from the legislature or something like that. Within my legal tradition, this is a bit of a specialized subtopic, but if you want to say that the Roman law is insufficient or is wrong, and that you want to either adapt it, or you want to alter it, or you want to add something to it that was missing, um, in some sense, you could try to create a new kind of legislation to do that, as long as it doesn't contradict the existing common law, which has the substantive Roman Dutch law in my legal tradition at its core. You would be free to do that, as long as it would essentially not contradict all the legal principles in the Roman law. Um, and I would actually argue that if you can't do that without contradicting those principles, or without sort of finding out how to navigate those principles, then actually what you want to do probably is a kind of utopian pie in the sky, disgusting abrogation, and you're trying to create a theocracy or something like that. And it's not going to be justifiable, and it's also going to lead to problems. It's going to lead to developmental problems as well. You're going to end up messing up the new generation. I mean, this is like, you can get a whole lot of group together, you can get a whole lot of people together, and you can join a new age cult. But then the next generation of people that are born into that cult, can you actually assimilate them? Because everyone that went along with you to make this cult, they were all, they decided that it made sense to them. But does it potentially make sense to everyone? And can you actually look? I mean, there is some value in having control and having choice over your own education as a family for your children, because I think that we do have the right to develop our own culture, and to even be disparate, and to even have our own school of thought, and to try to specialize and try to create a new, in some sense, that we have the liberty to have that kind of internal cultural experimentation within our personal affairs that should include our family affairs or something like that. So in some sense, we do have to tolerate certain kinds of cult behavior, but I would just point to the failures of cults are often in the next generation, because although they seem to have some kind of harmony, they seem to have some kind of stability, they're fundamentally psychologically unstable, and that is, the proof is in the pudding of that they can't replicate their own, they can't reproduce themselves in the next generation, or they don't have a high, or they get stupider and stupider, because the next generation has to kind of believe in this watered down lowest common denominator, and the kind of experiences that they have growing up are so kind of anti developmental that they kind of, they end up with a very kind of unstable personal sense of responsibility, essentially. So it's interesting. I mean, a lot of this, I was even thinking, well, let's just imagine that you keep improving standards, and you improve education up to such a level that society actually becomes completely peaceful and harmonious. That you would still have to have the same kind of struggle through the unconsciousness, through the Keegan stage 3, but that struggle would be confined to either educational modalities and personal development through playing video games, or playing, it would be gamified. It would, in some sense, it would be a part of the culture. It would be a subset of, it would be integrated in a way in which we would understand. Okay, well, in Star Trek, The Next Generation, they had this game that they used to play. I think Phareses Squares it was called. I've never understood what it is because but it was always understood to be quite a violent game. It was like that you could get seriously injured playing this game, and it would always be a thing about young children being old enough to play Phareses Squares with a certain, because you can't just kind of start too early and then you'll break your neck. You have to kind of be strong enough, but it is a dangerous game, especially when you're playing with people that are older than you. And so there's that danger element of playing games, and in some sense, I think that is a fundamental that we can't outgrow that. We can't sort of, in some sense, I don't. I mean, maybe there might be some forms of effective virtualism or something like that, but the idea about virtualism, I think that needs the concept that needs to be added to it is the concept of an objective morality. And in some sense, you can't test the bounds of objective morality if it's all just a kind of virtual, tentative, hypothetical sort of good enough substructure. It has to be actually visceral and authentic and genuine. But anyway, this is a tangent that I'm about to add now about this. I don't know if this is directly related to this, but I just want to talk about the differences between sentient life and non-sentient life, like animals. And maybe some animals are a bit sentient, maybe some of them, like whales. I'm not sure about whales, essentially. But you can have a lot of animals can have a lot of brain power even and not be sentient. And let me just tell you technically what my definition of sentience is. So sentience, you could say, is very much connected with the capacity to having free will, for exercising free will, and the necessary condition for that capacity is conceptual understanding. And let me just tell you the difference between a human being that is sentient, or I think pretty much all human beings are sentient, even if they're in severe forms of unconsciousness and even, like being comatose even, or whatever. Um, anyway, I don't want to get to talk about brain states or whatever. I'm just on the metaphysics of it. This is what sentience is. Sentience is understanding a concept of not understanding something. The understanding of a placeholder for an understanding that does not exist. So you know that you don't understand. You understand that you don't yet understand something. So you have a placeholder that means not understood yet or misunderstood. So in some sense, the negative of an understanding is the first concept, is the prime concept. And I think that this is also somewhat the resolution to the simultaneous mystery of life in the subconscious. This is why beliefs are all fundamentally toxic and have a naive narcissism about them, is because without the context of the gradation between understanding and misunderstanding and all the different metrics and all the different potential perspectives and points of views that can be had about anything, means that it's not just about you either have the belief that it's gold and the belief is gold or not, the belief is objectively true or not. There's no such thing as objectively true beliefs. It's a belief plus a belief plus a context together has a quality of understanding. And that can only ever be called a quality of understanding because there can be a novated context. Context isn't stable, almost axiomatically by definition. And the ability to postulate new context is the static ability that one has, to do in a very clear way when you have actually created a stable, solid state in your ego, in your use of your free cognitive functions. So the metafluidity really is to do with beliefs, essentially. But so essentially, almost the only belief that actually, in some sense, in a prime sense, functions across the board in an objective way is the concept of misunderstanding, is the belief that that misunderstanding is real. Misunderstanding is real, is a real objective thing, and it in some sense is not real according to some objective truth, except if you understand that the only objective truth that exists is not about reality, it's about morality. That we can attain towards some kind of meeting place around an objective morality, but obviously you can't just kind of, and that's a kind of transpersonal thing which has the personal layer in it and it has the interpersonal layer in it as a connected trifecta, as a connected tripartite distinction that is important to regulate that, and that's an ongoing embodied regulation in some sense. That is the days of our lives. Um, and there's a season and there's a time for everything, there's a time and a place, blah blah blah. You can sort of read Genesis chapter 1, and I think this comes through anyway. Okay, I think I've covered what I wanted to cover, but essentially I just wanted to say that just maybe as a theme as well to understand in principle that that and this is very important to the basic operation of law itself, that the concept of sentience, the respect that we give in law to sentient beings do not yet have free will necessarily. They haven't actualized it, but they are badly using free will, or they're abusing themselves, or in some form of self-abuse of their own free will, of irresponsibility, but they don't even properly understand the concept of responsibility because they think that their beliefs can be objectively true because there's some kind of external objective reality that underpins everything, rather than that there's a kind of external metaphysical, transpersonal, spiritual law that underpins everything. And so they've deflated the transpersonal and they've overinflated the interpersonal or intersubjective or something like that, because they've categorically destroyed a transpersonal conduit to Keegan stage 4. And so, a kind of the systematicity that people have on Keegan stage 4 that does not involve morality, that does not involve law, that just has kind of factoids, that does not respect sentient life in some sense, I think is fundamentally not fit for purpose to being properly called. I mean, in some sense, I think that will always be what is generally referred to as Keegan stage 4.5, nihilism, which I would rather describe as a kind of compartmentalized amoralism, and it will usually come in one of these varieties, in the variety of panentheism, in the variety of perennialism, and in the variety of solipsism, which will be some kind linked to some kind of idolatry, which is in some sense you can metaphorically understand that as a kind of animal husbandry, that and when I say animal husbandry, that you have given over the status of sentience to some kind of animalistic metaphorical form, that, oh yeah, we are just like this metaphor, this non-sentient metaphor. You've got this kind of misanthropic conceptual confusion where you have amalgamated the human being with a kind of with an animal state of being. This is the archetype of the beast in Revelation. You have been conditioned like a beast has been conditioned. You take yourself as a metaphor of some beast of the field, conditioned by its passions and by its environment, by some combination of its nature and its nurture. You are conditioned. You don't have real free will. You don't have real transpersonal latitude, or the height of sort of having a transcendental perspective on that is the dream of the vision that you have that comes from your eye, that extends from your personal outward. That is how the Greeks saw vision. That it was not the external locus of control of having the outside impress itself on your senses. It was that the purpose, the teleos of the eye is to look out, is to search out, is that it's a searching sight, that the vision is a search, that it's self-directed. The internal locus of control is respected. It's not an external locus of control. And the transpersonal has all of that within its efficacy, within its wheels within wheels and such. Anyway, I've talked about, but essentially the animal husbandry thing is an interesting thing. I mean, that is also how lust is. That is in some sense what the meaning of what lust is. When the scriptures talk badly about the lust, in some sense, that you have a value which is a weird kind of infinite power metaphor, that it's this kind of, because you've actually humanized. I don't want to talk too badly about, but I'd link this to the child function. Basically, you're misusing your child. The child function is essentially correspondent with the cognitive function that relates to the lust, but in MBTI jargon. But and in some sense, the lust is a natural knock-on effect of the death, which is the conditioning of the beast. So, in some sense, the death and the beast are very much the same archetype, and the lust and the whore of Babylon is sort of the same kind of archetype. And anyway, this is going to go on and on, but between those two, there's a kind of animal husbandry that is often synthesized into the vanity, into the dominant function. And the only way to disabuse that dominant function of its being, because in some sense the dominant function is symbolically Babylon the Great. That Babylon the Great, the city of Babylon, has all the values in it. All the rich kings and merchants are drunk on the wrath of the fornication with the whore. So they are angry about having sex with the whore. It makes them angry, but they are addicted to the anger. They are drunkards. They are inebriated on that. That is their drink. That their alcoholic drink is the anger that they feel when they fornicate with the whore, because they all fornicate with the whore. So they are all the kings of Babylon. It's weird because all the rich kings, and so that this city, this great Babylon the Great, has many kings and many values, and they don't have a system. They don't have an integrity because their queen is not a queen. Their queen is a whore. Their lust is a whore. It's not a queen. And so what you get here is the only way to bring order is to actually sort of collapse the whole thing, but to repurpose it, to reclaim the blood of the saints, which have seeped into the stonework and the mortar of Babylon the Great. And because it also has the whore of Babylon is drinks from a cup that is filled by the blood of the saints. That's all the imagery used in Revelations, and essentially the way to reclaim that blood and is essentially through the integration of the inferior function, which is essentially in this sense is linked to the transpersonal. That the transpersonal is the inferior function, and people are so afraid of integrating their own inferior function because they don't want to give up the riches of Babylon. They don't want to give up the riches of their dominant function. So they dig in their heels and they stay orientated in the personal that has an allegiance with the interpersonal. So their personal is plugged into their interpersonal. They're plugged into the matrix. They want to go back. They're like Cypher in the matrix. Plug me back in. I don't want to remember anything. I've seen the transpersonal. I would rather forget. I've seen what the transpersonal is leading to. It's a never, I don't believe that we can win the war. I don't believe that there's a stable liberation that can happen. Take me back. I want to go back into the matrix. And many people have that attitude. They are a cipher, but they will they will say, they'll spin it a different way. You know, they'll say, in some sense, they are of two minds. They'll lie to themselves about it. They are a cipher, but they'll make themselves out to be a different kind of freedom fighter or something like that. They'll say, no, 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 the Matrix is liberation. The Matrix is good for us. The Matrix is, we need to make the Matrix, we already have everything human beings deserve in the Matrix. That's good for us. This is evolution. We need to go back into the Matrix. That this freedom fighter bullshit, it's a cult. Like Morpheus lied to me. That's what Cypher says. We need to go, that's where we get the metafluidity back in the Matrix, where we can be wizards and we can do whatever we want, and but within the rules. Give us the rules. um and that's what we deserve. In some, okay, it it's weird because it is half baked and it is confused, but in some sense it's saying I'm a realist, and this vision is just, it's too over the top, it's too crazy. um this vision of rebellion, or of some kind of compromise or some kind of resettlement. There's no resettlement that can be made or something like that. It's lost hope in the transpersonal, or it has a very badly developed transpersonal, and they've sort of lost, they don't have a faith. Their faith is actually in the interpersonal. Their faith is entrenched and invested into the interpersonal realism. So they always claim to be more realistic and less believing in fairies or something like that. You know, it's very nicely in the Matrix. So I would, anyway, that's kind of what I've been talking about to some degree as well in this addendum. Anyway, I've been talking for too long, so let me stop the recording.